Okay. Well, I really appreciate everyone taking the time to attend here this session of the UTD Teach-In series on fighting legacies of white supremacy at UTD and beyond. I'll invite everyone who is here not as a presenter to please turn off both your mic and your camera. We'll keep our presenters' mics their cameras on, and their mics will you can join the conversation here when it's your time, but everybody else will ask you to stay on mute. We do want to hear from you, however, so please send comments and questions through the chat function. Those will all come to me, and towards the second half of the event here, as we have our Q&A, I will be sharing your questions with the panelists and hopefully engaging in a lively conversation. So I want to begin by thanking the School of Arts and Humanities, the Gender Center, and the Office of Community Engagement at UT Dallas. Again, this is one of many teach-ins, and I encourage all to sign up for our email list, which is posted in the chat. We will be making a video available of this conversation, and that will go out via the email list. We'll be sending action items. If you are roused to action by this conversation, we will have specific things that you can do to make a positive difference. And also we'll have updates on forthcoming events. Now, before we begin this discussion of history, holidays, monuments, and memory, we have to begin by acknowledging the history and legacy of colonization. UTD stands on the occupied territory of Apache, Wichita, Caddo, and Comanche people. The legacies of white supremacy at UTD and beyond begins with this history of colonization. So our conversation on history, holidays, monuments, and memory will have 6 brief presentations. Then what we very much hope will be a robust and engaging conversation with the audience. Again, ask questions in the chat box as they come to you. And I will introduce our presenters one at a time, beginning with Axum Taylor. And I think it's really fitting that we are going to both begin and end with the voices of students. It was students, after all, that first organized to express their displeasure at the June Town Hall, which instigated this teach-in series. And it was students from the Black Student Alliance who first proposed changes to improve life at UTD, and we'll hear more about their proposed changes later on today. So we're going to begin with Axum Taylor, who is a junior interdisciplinary studies major with a concentration in public health. Axum formerly worked as a student success and outreach assistant for the Multicultural Center, and she currently serves on the Living Our Values Task Force here at UTD. So Axum, take it away.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, so just to really briefly go into, I guess, how this task force came about and how students have organized during the summer, specifically during June, so we had seen a number of other universities across the country. Their students were, a lot of the Black students on campus were starting to talk more openly about some of the grievances and some of the, adversity that they had faced while attending their universities. We'd seen a number of letters being sent to other universities, such as, just locally speaking, UT Austin, as well as the University of North Texas. And so this really resonated with a lot of the students here. And so one of the students, I think just to also preface that we're not a student organization. A lot of the students that have came together in writing a list of demands that we wanted to send to UT Dallas administration, it was just 6 of us. So we're not necessarily a one student organization. The 6 students that have organized, including me and Tamara, we had been in multiple student organizations. So Black Student Alliance, African Student Union, Habesha Student Union, all of the Black orgs on campus were really starting to have a dialogue about the things that were happening. And all of this was really triggered by the Black Lives Matter uprising. We really thought about what are ways that we can leave a positive impact on campus and ways in which that'll help dismantle systematic racism in spaces we all take up. So one of the 6 students initially started with writing a letter to send to the president And then immediately after, he had this idea, he brought it to every student within the Black student orgs on campus. And this is when I and Tamara and 3 other students were really hands-on with this letter. We decided that it wouldn't just be best to talk about some of the experiences that we had faced just on an individual level, but we decided to take this out and, really survey and speak with the other students on campus to see what their experiences were, kind of where their thoughts were as far as, the experiences that they faced and how they would like to see them improved. During my time working in the Multicultural Center, I feel extremely confident in knowing there's a number of resources on campus that are designed to help supplement the experience for students of color. There was a lot of gray area, just in the sense that there was needs that were not being met. A lot of students had experiences that made them feel uncomfortable, alienated, just purely discriminated against, and it wasn't right. So rather than looking at it as this is just something that we have to experience, this country, while we might be taking small strides, this is just part of our lived experiences. We really wanted to take the initiative to make a difference and to make a change, because we all love UT Dallas, especially as students. We want to feel proud about the institution that we're going to. So with that being said, we had spoken out to a number of students. We had created a Zoom call that lasted, I believe it was like a total of 6 hours. We were just on this call having students just come in, speak on, the different resources that they thought could be better, how funding could be allocated more towards the Multicultural Center, just things like that. So students just continued to speak on, some of their experiences, and we ended up with a document that listed 15 different demands that Black students would like to see on campus to not only enrich our experience, but to make sure that whenever the university is being awarded for its diversity and inclusion, that they're also making sure that the voices of Black students are being heard. And so that's really how we started. We took this demand and sent it to different administrators. We sent it to the president's office, as well as some other schools or departments. And a lot of the feedback that we got was incredibly helpful. It was incredibly encouraging from staff and faculty. However, now that we have seen that, administration took a look at these lists of demands, that's when the idea for the creation of a task force was decided. However, I do want to note that while they did create this task force, they did not reach out to us, the students who created this list of demands. So by this time, we had reached out to a number of individuals. We had reached out to student government. There was some other different departments that we had reached out to that we hadn't received a response back from. So then once it was announced that this task force was being created, we had only noticed that 2 of the 6 students that had collectively created this list of demands had been added to the task force. And the rest of us would be, we weren't invited to the first meeting. We were just listed as guests. Now, obviously, I think this was incredibly disheartening to hear. The first meeting that all of the students were invited into to help dissect the logistics behind our demands. We were heard out by administration, but it has been a pretty challenging experience, to be honest, just in the sense that these demands were sent in late June, specifically June 17th is when these were sent out. And now we're looking at August 6th, and we're just now getting the ball rolling. So there's been a lot of systematic experiences that we've even still faced. There was a number of other students from different organizations, fraternities, and a number of other student orgs that haven't been as positive in giving us feedback with these list of demands, but we weren't surprised too much. But ultimately, as we're on this task force, we're really, really trying to make sure that the change that we want to see, and the voices of students is getting amplified. And the last thing we want is for our voices to be silenced, especially as students, because at the end of the day, all of these demands are created by students for students. And we've had plenty of help from the Black Faculty and Staff Alliance. They've also submitted a list of demands, and I see administration definitely being a lot more, just a lot more receptive in a lot of the things that they've said. But ultimately, we want a climate and culture at UT Dallas that does encourage social justice, as well as encourage ways that we can innovate and improve the experiences of all students. But as much as we've done, as kind of tiring as it has been, and the amount of emotional labor that has gone into it, I still have the same drive and motivation as, you know, speaking for myself as we did in the beginning, and for the rest of the students, just in the sense that we know that the change and the impact that we're working really hard to get now will have lasting effects. And I have no doubt in my mind that the experiences of the students after us are going to be much better, and holistically just a lot more inclusive, and just a lot more, they're going to be met with a lot more compassion and empathy in the future. So I do look forward to that. And again, I'm very happy to know that there's faculty and staff that are also invested in creating a more inclusive and better change at UT Dallas. So thank you.
Thank you, Axum. We appreciate that. I'll remind folks that if you have questions for Axum or anybody else that presents, please feel free to add them in the chat. We're going to hold questions until everyone has presented, but as a question comes to your mind, please feel free to share it. Now, I'm going to speak here briefly, taking a step back, and also, quite frankly, discussing really the issues that made this student organizing come to my attention and the attention of many of my colleagues who wanted to be a part of productive change here at UTD. And this happened in the aftermath of a town hall that occurred in June, where a student taking action, asked the question about why UTD staff does not have Juneteenth off as a holiday. In the response to that question, the administrators explained that UTD does in fact celebrate Juneteenth through a bunch of events through the Multicultural Center, and that Juneteenth is actually commemorated or celebrated in late December every few years in order to provide staff with an extended winter break between the two semesters. However, as part of this explanation, we also discovered, and it was said, and in fact, Juneteenth was equated to Confederate Heroes Day, a date that remains on the books in the state of Texas as a state holiday. So I quickly want to have a conversation about this history, about the Confederacy, and about Juneteenth, as a way of thinking about the way that history might be able to inform our conversations about contemporary racial injustice, and provide opportunities for us to think about changes that we can make. So in my remarks, which will be very brief, I promise, I want to begin actually in Austin, in our state capital, where the Confederate Soldiers Monument proclaims, etched in stone, that the Confederate dead it honors, quote, died for states' rights. This, as we will see, is a myth, but it's a myth that itself has a history, and untangling that history is of value. So Frederick Douglass wisely noted in 1877 that the United States was already in danger of forgetting what the Civil War was fought for, and he had good reason to fear. In 1866, less than a year after the war had ended, Edward A. Pollard, a Richmond journalist, wrote a history of the Civil War that he titled The Lost Cause. And among a host of other lies, including that slavery elevated the African and was in the interest of human improvement, Pollard also claimed that the South fought to preserve the rights of states. 3 years later, former Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, completed his own 2-volume history, which again echoed this myth that the Southern commitments to states' rights rather than slavery is what motivated secession. And this Stephens' contribution is particularly ironic, as just 6 years earlier, he very boldly and unequivocally claimed that slavery was, in his words, the cornerstone of the Confederacy. Now, this history, or really this myth, continues to haunt us. Today, the U.S. citizenship test includes a question regarding the causes of the Civil War, and 3 answers are accepted as correct. Slavery, the correct answer, but also folks can say states' rights or economic reasons. And these myths continue to haunt public discourse. So I'm just going to take a very brief few minutes to provide quotations from Confederates themselves as to why they seceded and why they fought against the United States. So we have to start in South Carolina, the first state to secede, who blamed, quote, the President of the United States, whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. In Mississippi, quote, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world, end quote. In Florida, quote, slavery is the element of all value, and a destruction of that destroys all that is property. In Louisiana, quote, the people of the slaveholding states are bound together by the same necessity and determination to preserve African slavery. We see it again and again. In Alabama, the election of Mr. Lincoln is hailed as the downfall of slavery. It will inaugurate all the horrors of a Haitian servile insurrection, consigning her citizens to assassinations and her wives and daughters to pollution and violation, to gratify the lust of half-civilized Africans. Again, we see slavery and white supremacy in these rationales for why the South seceded and why the Confederates fought against the United States. What about here in Texas? Well, in Texas, we have one of the most explicit claims for the centrality of slavery and white supremacy. As the Texas secessionists claimed, I quote, in this free government, all white men are, and of right ought to be entitled to equal civil and political rights. That the servitude of the African race, as existing in these states, is mutually beneficial to both bond and free. So the Confederacy's primary reason for its existence was the perpetuation of slavery and white supremacy. But the Confederacy lost its war for independence. On June 19th, 1965, Major General Gordon Granger of the United States Army landed at Galveston, Texas. The Confederacy had fallen, and the arrival of these Union soldiers meant that the Emancipation Proclamation, issued 2.5 years earlier, would now finally take effect. Juneteenth marked a decisive moment, and subsequent generations of Black Americans celebrated the holiday and its often unfulfilled promises of freedom. For the rest of the 19th century, Juneteenth celebrations were largely solemn and religious. Black Texans gathered in churches to honor the sacrifices made by their ancestors to force emancipation and the end of slavery. Marches led to public parks where picnics continued festivities. By the 20th century, public committees formed, spending months planning increasingly elaborate celebrations of emancipation. Beginning in the 1920s, Juneteenth became fun. It became a day to show off your finest clothes, and marches transformed into parades, culminating in more elaborate feasts. With the rise of the Black Power movement in the 1970s, Juneteenth took on a renewed political importance as Black Texans more forcefully asserted their demands for justice and celebrated through music and art fairs. In 1980, Juneteenth was first honored as a recognized state holiday in Texas, although we have to say it functions at UTD as an optional holiday that is observed every few years to extend winter break, and UTD staff do not get June 19th off to celebrate with the community. Since the 1980s, Juneteenth extended its reach beyond Texas. Ralph Ellison's 1999 posthumously published novel Juneteenth is one but of many popular culture celebrations of the holiday, and a movement is still pushing to make the day a national holiday. Juneteenth marks the antithesis of all that the Confederacy stood for, but it would be wrong to imply that this is solely a triumphant story. The formerly enslaved in the South still faced considerable challenges, including widespread white vigilante terrorism, re-enslavement through debt peonage and convict leasing, and the passage of laws designed to circumscribe an array of freedoms. We know that the rise of Jim Crow brought lynching, segregation, economic subordination, forced sterilization, convict leasing, and laws designed to thwart the rights of African Americans to vote, such as the poll tax and literacy requirements. Now, the memory of the Confederacy, the creation of its monuments, and the rewriting of history in the model of the lost cause animated all of these injustices. And despite the advances of the civil rights movement, white supremacy continues to haunt our nation. It ensnares our institutions, including our universities. History, holidays, monuments, and memory all make claim on our identity and indeed on our values. If we continue to celebrate the Confederacy, or if we fail to adequately recognize Juneteenth, we are living our values only if our values include white supremacy. Okay, that's enough for me. Let's move from the past a bit into the present. And I want us to bring in Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, who is a scholar in residence at the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona College. She is senior fellow at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies and the professorial lecturer at the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. She is the author of the widely celebrated recent book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of the American Institution, and she recently served as a historian for the White House Historical Association. Dr. Chervinsky, we're hoping that you can, for us, broaden this conversation and talk about what this history might mean for national discourse about history and memory and monuments.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. And thank you also for starting with the land call out. Since I am in Virginia, I would like to make a similar recognition of the land that I actually personally own was actually the ancestral heritage land of the Nacostin and Piscataway people. And so as we're having conversations about the many different ways that white supremacy is entrenched in our society, I always think that's a really important first place to start. But Ben, your talk was such a helpful sort of tie-in to why I'm here, which is sort of ironic given that I did just publish a book about a bunch of old dead white founders. And one of the things that I frequently get asked when I'm talking about my work is, what should we make of the monument conversation, of the statue conversation? What do you think? What should I think? And so it's a very important and fraught conversation because it's not just about statues, but it's about who we choose to remember and who we choose to commemorate and what messaging that's conveying to the people who are around those spaces. That language, notice, is not about history, it's about commemoration, and I think that's a really important distinction. Statues themselves did not march on a battlefield and then all of a sudden become stone. So we're not talking about eradicating people. We're talking about potentially changing what sort of statues we choose to commemorate, what moments of history we think are really important. One of the things that I always ask audience members or students to think about is, what is the message of this statue trying to convey? And usually the celebrations around these statues or these monuments offer a really fantastic guide to what we should think. So for example, the Sam Houston statue has received a lot of attention on the campus of UNC Chapel Hill. And those, the ceremonies surrounding the statue put up, the speeches are particularly violent. They are particularly telling. They are not at all subtle. And it is a celebration of the end of Reconstruction and the completion of Jim Crow laws taking over society and suppressing the Black right to vote and to be equal citizens. And again, these are not subtle speeches. They are incredibly violent. And so that is a really important part of this story, is that the statues were not put up to celebrate these people's contributions to society. They are put up to celebrate their role in maintaining white supremacy. So that's sort of the first piece that I always think about. And then, naturally people say, well, okay, what about people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington? They owned hundreds of enslaved individuals and were absolutely complicit in a system of white supremacy. And that's a very valid question. And I think that that's probably a decision that no one can make for you but yourself. But I've found scholar Annette Gordon-Reed's comments on this to be particularly instructive. She is a Black woman. For those of you who don't know who she is, she rose to historical fame by writing sort of the books on Sally Hemings and bringing that story to a much broader audience. And what she basically said is that the statues for the founders are put up not because of their flaws, but in spite of their flaws. And the statues for the Confederates were put up because of the things we now hold to be abhorrent. And I don't know if that is a distinction that everyone is willing to accept, but it is, I think, an interesting thought process to think about as we're sort of working through this problem. The last sort of bit that I want to sort of acknowledge is that this conversation and our landscape of commemoration should not be a static one. It should be a fluid and ongoing conversation. What we choose to celebrate in 2020 is not what one would celebrate in 1820. And that is appropriate and just and right, because as our values evolve and the things that we choose to celebrate, so too should the people that we choose to celebrate. And the messaging that maybe some of these statues and monuments convey in 2020 doesn't necessarily sit right with us in the way that it may have 100 or 200 years ago. So for example, one of the statues that I think is most instructive in this is the Abraham Lincoln statue that is in Boston. And for those of you who don't know the history behind the statue, it was paid for by a group of formerly enslaved individuals, but then a white artist created the design for the statue and it was put up. And so initially when I was sort of hearing some of these conversations, I was thinking, you know, I'm not sure I necessarily want to encourage people to pull down statues that had been funded by formerly enslaved people. I don't think that's right. But then I was listening to testimony by a woman who lives in Boston and has to walk through the square all the time. And she was an African-American woman, and she was telling the story that she was walking through the park and her daughter, who was about 5 at the time, said, "Mom, why is that man who looks like Dad on his knees?" And that is not something that would necessarily occur to me, one, because I don't have children, and two, because as a white woman, I am not necessarily harmed in the same way by these statues. I do not have the same sort of messaging that is conveyed. But it's really important for us to listen to the people that do feel harm with these statues and to acknowledge that not everyone is going to feel the same way about holidays or monuments or different forms of commemoration. But if it is a public space and people are harmed by it, then that is something that even if I don't necessarily instinctively feel that harm, that is something we do have to take into account. So that would sort of be the other piece is, you know, these values should evolve, but then also we have to acknowledge that not everyone is going to feel the same way. And then the last thing I would say is if anyone is, you know, interested in reading a little bit more about this material, there's been such extraordinary work in the last couple of months, public outreach by historians about Confederate monuments. Hillary Green is an incredible historian who's done a ton of work documenting where these memorials and statues are and how they've evolved and changed. Kevin Levine is another one who's talked a lot about myth and memory. And lastly, Adam Dombey has a book called The False Cause that talks about sort of the Confederate memory. So those would be 3 examples that I would highly encourage, 3 of many, but if anyone wants to do a little bit more reading about the subject.
Thank you, Dr. Chervinsky. That's wonderful. And we always encourage more reading here around UTD. So grab those studies and investigate it for yourself. Now we get to turn to Dr. Sharron Conrad, who is, we are very proud to say, a graduate of UTD with a PhD in History of Ideas. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Presidential History at SMU, where she is finishing a book on the memory of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson within the Black community. She has previously worked at museums around the country. And we've asked Dr. Conrad to come here today to give us a little bit more insight in how the Black community have used history as a weapon against racism.
Thank you very much, Ben. And it was terrific hearing your comments and hearing Axum kind of lay things out and how we kind of came to this moment. And Lindsay was provided a really wonderful, I think, overview of kind of where things stand right now in these conversations that are happening nationally. As Ben says, I am a UTD alum, a very proud alum, and the University of Texas at Dallas has been very good to me. I learned there, I taught there, and what happens there means a lot to me. And so I was completely honored to be invited to participate in this conversation about the future of this institution and kind of how we can all work together to make sure that it is as strong as it should be. I also think I was invited to join this discussion because of my research, which, as Ben mentioned, focuses in on African American history and memory, and both of which relate to the themes that have been talked about already. My scholarship examines how African Americans understand the past and how we often circulate our own interpretation of past events. And sometimes our interpretations of the past are in conflict with the way that scholars and journalists kind of talk about the past and understand the past. And I think that that's an important thing to recognize and to be mindful of in these conversations. Central to my work is the way that African Americans mourned the death of President John Kennedy. And specifically, I found that in the Black community, a lot of families and households would memorialize President Kennedy in very distinctive and personal ways. And in some ways that memorialization was done as a way to kind of contradict what the larger society might have been saying, to create what scholars call a Black counter memory of John Kennedy. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is. But this is true of my own story growing up, where my godmother had pictures of President Kennedy up in her household, and it taught me something. She was passing down a message to me, to the future generations, about what President Kennedy was and how I should interpret his leadership. And so one of the points that I want to make about that is just the way that if you ask historians, over the past decades, C-SPAN has conducted a survey of presidential historians and asked them to rank presidents in terms of how they, which presidents are the best presidents in a series of categories. And one of those categories was which president most pursued justice for all. And for the presidential historians, the rankings come down to Abraham Lincoln and Lyndon Johnson as some of the presidents that most represent and pursue justice for all. But if you look at surveys through the years, both starting in the 1960s and up until more recent Gallup surveys, if you ask African Americans which president kind of did the most for African American civil rights, many of them will rank John Kennedy higher than Lyndon Johnson. And so this is just a kind of example of this kind of disconnect between the way that scholars interpret things and the way that people in the community interpret the same thing. And so my research really very poignantly focuses on the fact that, whereas scholars may point to make conclusions about what's relevant about the past, what's meaningful about the past. Sometimes they do that without asking communities that are most affected by these stories that are being told what they think about the past and how they interpret those same events. And I think that is doing a disservice to understanding about these past events. So this is why when we kind of look at a community's monuments, the ways that buildings are titled, street names are determined, other spaces of significance are kind of brought forward, those symbols reflect what may have been important at a specific place and time in terms of what was significant or important, but they don't necessarily always ask the question, are these places, are these names, are they relevant and important to whom? To whom are these things important? Who gets to decide on the significance of these things? And so one of the things that I like to focus on is just this point of, marginalized communities are often marginalized, even in terms of kind of what we tend to view as important, significant about the past. And yet as African Americans and other communities, not just the African American community, but specifically for African Americans, we've historically, very quietly, very determinedly kind of used memory and our own thoughts about the past as a way of contradicting the way that perhaps the larger society views events. And we do this in things like our oral tradition of passing down stories from one generation to the next. We do this when we are interviewed for oral histories. We do this at our family reunions. We do this at events of significance like historically Black college reunions. In homecomings, we do this at, in our family genealogies. We do this in the holidays that we choose to celebrate, like Juneteenth, like Martin Luther King Day. We do this by preserving spaces of significance, like in downtown Dallas. There's a wonderful kind of in transition space, the Juanita Craft Civil Rights House, which is a small house museum that's owned by the city of Dallas. We do this by supporting spaces like the Miller Cabin in Millermore, at the Dallas Heritage Village, at Old City Park in downtown Dallas. We preserve and celebrate memories of the past that are often at odds with the way that the larger society does. But it is kind of part of that kind of Black counter memory work that we do in order to kind of alert our younger generations about what's significant, even if it is in kind of there's a disconnect between what's being taught in the history books, what's being taught, in our on the news and in documentaries. And so we continue to see this work being done in places like in our historians, like W.E.B. Du Bois writing about the Reconstruction period. We see this in wonderful writers like Zora Neale Hurston in the way that she's documenting Black ethnography in the South and the cadences and the culture of the community that she grew up in. We see this in people like Ida B. Wells documenting the history of lynching in American society. And so we do this work, and it is hard to do. And I wanted to just quickly share a quote from two historians who edited a book of essays on Black civil rights memory, Renee Romano and Lee Rayford, in their book called The Civil Rights Movement in American Memory. They say that, quote, "The historical memory of the movement as revealed in popular culture, political arenas, and sites like museums, rather than the history of the movement as described in scholarly works, prioritizing the stories various groups choose to tell about the movement in the past in order to make sense of and mobilize in the present." And so essentially what they're saying is these things that we don't always think of as means of communicating history are there, and they're doing good work in the Black community. And we even see this in recent films like, the new Spike Lee film on the Five Bloods, kind of looking at Vietnam from the perspective of veterans, films like Selma, directed by Ava DuVernay, to kind of reinterpret the Selma March from the perspective of Martin Luther King and the African-American activists who led that march. And even films like Hidden Figures, which wasn't directed by an African-American, but certainly comes from an African-American woman historian. And so all of that to say is that these are just a few of the ways that African Americans are subverting kind of this history of race that doesn't always include their stories. And so I want to just commend, the Black Student Alliance at UTD. So big shout out to Axum and Tamara for the work that they're doing and the leadership that they are showing, because I think that UTD is a fantastic place. It can be an even better place. I want to encourage some of the demands that I saw in the document that they created. I think that things like a public history program at the university is really, really important. And I know that Dr. Whitney Stewart is doing work around that. I celebrate the idea of UTD creating a Black Studies program because it's needed. And not only is that kind of programming needed and that kind of coursework needed, but Black instructors are needed as well. And so I just want to say thanks again for allowing me to be here. And I can't wait to hear what Dr. Keaton has to say about all the incredible work that he's doing on the ground here in Dallas.
Thank you, Dr. Conrad. That was fantastic. And yeah, we can see, you all can see now why UTD is so proud of many of our alums. That was wonderful. We will now turn to Dr. Keaton, who is the founder of Remembering Dallas, an organization that preserves and promotes the African-American life, history, artifacts, and culture of Dallas and its surrounding cities. Dr. Keaton previously served 31 years in the Dallas Independent School District. He is a certified saint and has long been on the front lines in conflicts over history and memory in Dallas. And we want to hear more about that particular Dallas context for these conversations. So with that, Dr. Keaton.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thanks to everyone and the Alliance and the staff at the UTD. But just to reflect back on all of the speakers have done, really touched on most of, at least 3/4 of what I'd like to say, but I still would like to maybe end up with that 1/4 of information that I have to give to you and let you know that UTD, I'm a UNT graduate. And a lot of the things that I'm just so surprised after over 40 years in education, and then looking at the college level of students still having the same difficulties and struggles that I've had over 40 years ago at UNT. Racism was strong just as well as it may be today. In talking with some of the students from now at UTD, of course, it was in North Texas State University when I attended, but it's just interesting as I listen to find that we are still talking about racial issues. But to get to my topic, which is the debate on how the statutes are played out in the city of Dallas. First of all, I'm a native here, and I'm also a fifth generation. Actually, my great-great-grandfather bought his slaves here to this city of Dallas, specifically closer to where the Collins County. And his name was Jesse Turner. And this on my maternal side. And so to make a long story short, I am a descendant of probably a Confederate. His father was a Confederate soldier, and it has descended into generations that we've been here, and all of my family's here in Dallas. But as I grew up seeing the statues and really as a child, not really understanding the significance and the severity as well as to what they represented. And finally, I did learn, but to discuss how we came to where we are, even before we had the conversation with the George Floyd, and then the people started rioting against the statues and having them torn down. Dallas was already at conversation and debate as to removing the Robert E. Lee statue, which is now removed from Robert E. Lee Park. And of course, the name of the park has been changed. Also with the Confederate soldiers that are near the Coliseum and the Founders Cemetery, that has just recently been moved, but it was about 2 years, there was a debate that went on for those statues to be removed. And if you never seen them, they were huge. To me, they were like 10 stories high, the one in the middle. And then it had 4 others that were half the size around them. And it was just a huge statue. They were huge. It was like 5, maybe 5 or 6 of them with different Confederate soldiers. And then, of course, the Robert E. Lee, even though I thought it was a beautiful art piece, but what it represented was not really from what he himself wanted to be glorified in. And it's been noted that that was not something that he felt. And he said it years ago that the nation will not heal as long as we give glorification to these types of monuments and praise to a war that was lost. So I remember distinctly that the city council had asked our organization to come and speak, and we had Joyce King, who spoke in our behalf at the council meeting in the debate of the Confederate soldiers' statues. Not at that time, it was both of them, Robert E. Lee and the ones that are in the Founders Cemetery. So at that time, people say that you can feel hatred or feel tension. I heard that, but I had never really felt that. And at this particular meeting, after she gave a reading on, they asked what was our position or what was the African Americans' position as it relates to the Confederate soldiers' statues throughout the city. And I had never, this was my first experience of feeling hatred from people that I sat around, that was sitting next to me and in front of me and behind me. And it was an eerie feeling because I didn't realize that there were people who not only felt so strongly about their idols and their monuments, but also their actual feelings, how they actually felt about me as a person, because it did reflect me and their hatred toward African Americans in the city of Dallas. And I was just really taken back to think that we had so many people in that moment and that time really fighting for not just the statue, but in some ways, to me, it's like they were going to lose a certain amount of power that they had. They were going to lose a certain level of status that they had. And keep in mind that these ideas and thoughts of African-American people extended clearly far beyond the 60s. We all know that it started right after me doing Reconstruction. There were laws that were placed up for us to be minimal or less than a citizen of this city, and that was across the nation. And then being segregated into many neighborhoods. I personally didn't realize I was in a segregated neighborhood until I was grown. Or a teenager, to realize that there were people out there in other neighborhoods who did not like me. And then not only that, it came to the point of integration. And then that's when I really felt the hatred toward me as a person. But I also know and understand that the statues were a symbol and a part of this hatred, simply because when I look at, and so I think Chervinsky mentioned that how statues and symbols they give you a feeling. Just for an example, you have a cross. It has a symbol, it has a meaning, and it has depth to it as to what it means, just as a Confederate soldier. And then the situation with the debate at the City Hall was that we are destroying the history of Dallas. And first of all, none of those statues, none of those men were from Dallas, period. They were not even, probably had never been to Texas. But my point that I'm making is that they were confusing history with symbolism. And that's the same thing that's happening even today when they claim that you're taking away, we're not erasing their history, their symbolism. And you think about it, I remember a time growing up in Dallas when they took prayer out of the church, out of the school. We weren't allowed to pray anymore. And so to me, if we could do something that simple, why could it not be simple to remove symbols that are hurtful to a group of people? And so that was the biggest debate in these meetings that we had. And I think initially, we were in, I think the city of Dallas was in denial and have been for a long time from the 60s prior throughout my lifetime as it relates to race relationships. I believe that the city of Dallas has probably been in denial and still in denial more than most cities around, probably even more so than some of the cities that we have in the South. And so only about 2 years ago is when the controversy came up that we started asking. So once that happened, then we took a look at the symbols in the Fair Park. I did not realize that there were probably over 120 symbols of Confederate soldiers, murals, monuments, even on the sconces of the porch there, of the steps at the State Hall. There are Confederate soldiers all around each scone. And if you look at it closely, it's almost embedded. And I'm thinking, oh my God, how are we going to do this? So it started out with a Confederate soldiers committee. And after they said, well, they should be removed, then they developed, the mayor decided to keep out of the muddy water. He said, well, now we're going to set up another committee to discuss how we're going to handle this. And that was just really a stalling point, in my opinion, till he got out of office. And now he's out and kind of left us with the bag to hold. But then he set up this other committee that I was a part of, and I would not be in it if they were going to call it the Confederate Committee. So they finally changed it to the Recontextualization Committee, and it had a long name, even some more words after that. And I know my time is running out, and I'm anxious to hear from the students. I'm watching my time. But these are the kind of things that happened and went on. And so after the committee, the recontextualization was evolved. And then now there seems to be a lot of dialogue and information and groups and meetings that deal with race relationships, and also still a counterpart to these. The city's response was to build or construct other monuments like in the Martyrs Park, and also the Freedom's Jubilee Park, I believe is the name of it, off of Malcolm X. I may have that incorrect, but there are several parks and monuments that are being constructed, markers that are positive, showing positive Black people. And so this is how Dallas has been struggling through to recognize African Americans and the great things that they've done. And of course, my organization, we've done plays, and we have 4 markers coming up of prominent people who have done great things in Dallas. And so it's like we've been pushed under the rug and hidden, but no more now. We are coming forth, and we are becoming an example. So I can go on, but I'm sure there are questions that you would have, and I'll turn you back over to the hands of Dr. Wright. Thank you for your time and your efforts that you all are doing to make a difference in the city of Dallas.
Thank you, Dr. Keaton. That was great. Okay, now we will conclude with our presentations. And before actually we do that, I want to let everybody know that we've got a few questions that have come in through the chat, but folks are encouraged to please do send those. We will get to Q&A here very soon, so please do send your questions. But before that, we are lucky here to hear from Tamara Havis, who is a senior at UTD majoring in computer engineering. She is involved in several student organizations, such as the National Society of Black Engineers and the Black Congress. Being a leader in these organizations has afforded her the opportunity to meet with other Black leaders on campus and to collaboratively develop the call to action that was sent to the president, as well as grant her a student seat on the Living Our Values Task Force that was created. We're inviting Tamara to bring us up to speed here, pull this conversation back to UTD, and talk about maybe some things that we can be doing to improve life at UTD. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. As a person on the task force for the past couple months, it's definitely been a struggle getting there and staying there. And it's become very clear to me that across the board, faculty, staff, and some students seems to have forgotten that UTD is not a business, but an academic institution. And without the accomplishments of previous Black president, Dr. Franklin Jennifer, Black alumni, Black researchers, and most importantly, current Black students, UTD would not be where it is today. I truly believe that administration has lost and has no respect for students, because if they did, we would have received an apology for the slip on Confederate Heroes Day in the President's Town Hall on June 14th. Instead, in secrecy, in the Living Our Values Task Force, they have removed the mention of Confederate Heroes Day within the Academic Senate and Staff Council and is awaiting student government. Administration has felt it important enough to remove the name of those instances on our websites and in our academic calendar, yet the students have received no apology from that slip from administration that we were all a part of in the President's Town Hall, not just faculty and staff. Changes I would like to see at UTD is first changing the way administration has and is currently responding to the Black student body's call to action sent to the President on June 17th. Since May, I and other 8 students have roughly spent over 300 hours working with administration on the implementation of points to call to action. And in my opinion, less than a quarter of that time has been productive. Instead of being invited to meetings arguing about money and how COVID-19 is an inconvenient time for us to be implementing these Black student body demands, I want to be invited to meetings discussing why UTD prides itself on diversity and community engagement publicly, while in privacy, the Office of Diversity and Student Engagement is receiving budget cuts when they are the sole source of celebrating diversity on campus. I want to be invited to meetings discussing why underrepresented minorities are being excluded from receiving prominent UTD scholarships such as academic excellence for years, and we are giving the run on round on why we can't receive those numbers and are being asked to pay money on receiving those numbers. I want to be invited to a meeting discussing why faculty and staff are scared to speak out on systematic racism and other oppressions at UTD's campus. Faculty and staff have reached out to I and other students in private and in confidence and are scared, quite frankly, to speak out on administration on their issues, not less student issues. At the end of this, want there to be a pipeline put in place so no other student has to go through the amount of arguing and academic trauma and stress and uncompensated, unappreciated labor that the students have had to go through the past 3 months of our summer. Being on the Living Our Values Task Force has been a very stressful time. And despite being told this multiple times, I will not be putting this on my resume because quite frankly, I don't think it's something to be proud of. The fact that the university has to create an entire task force to abolish something that shouldn't be existing in the first place. UTD is an academic institution whose success is made and ran by students. And until that is appreciated and respected for all students, I definitely do feel like both in theory and practice, UTD will not be a place for students to thrive in. Most importantly, Black and other underrepresented minorities. Thank you for having me. I will accept any questions, and I really do appreciate all the help we received from faculty and staff thus far, and UTD could definitely do better in the future as far as making sure the pipeline is more clear so students don't have to go through the things we've gone through for the past 3 months. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you for speaking with us. That's wonderful. All right, we will now have the remainder of our time, which looks like it's 36 minutes for questions and answers. I'll encourage everyone to pull up the chat box, send me questions. We're gonna start with a question that talks about the influence of COVID for life on UTD and maybe in conversations about history and about memory. So the specific questions ask about how COVID, which we know, of course, has disproportionately affected students of color. How has it influenced students in Dallas or around UTD? And also thinking about not only Black students, but also international students or other minority students. Which, by the way, I have to quickly say, I love this question. And I think to do it full justice, we would need an entire teach-in around it, which I think is quite frankly something that we'll probably do. Stay tuned for conversations around issues facing international students and for teach-ins about COVID. But we have some wonderful voices here that can speak to this if anybody would like to touch on that issue.
I guess as a student, I can go first. So I am currently taking 9 credit hours this summer, and it's become clear to me that some of my professors, even as a computer engineering major, it is a privilege, not a right, to have access to internet and a working computer and cell phone. Some of the things I've been asked to do this summer don't respect that right. And as a computer engineering major, it's very hard to have to, make up things on the fly, especially during COVID-19 times. I would also like to say that the student band, the way administration responded to that immediately is the way administration should be responding to everything, and it shouldn't be out of financial incentive. It did not escape me that whenever the Black students sent a letter asking the president to speak on George Floyd's murder, it took the president several days to do that. However, immediately when international students were threatened leaving campus and weren't going to be able to financially pay coming here anymore, it was very clear that, oh, now it's an issue and we have to speak immediately. And the reason behind that, I am 100% believing it's money, which is ridiculous. So just in COVID-19 times, it's important to have compassion, to think about everybody and understand that just because it's better for you doesn't mean it's better for everyone else. And having technology and accessibility, especially at UTD, is extremely a privilege and not a right. And we need to do better as a community, understanding what that means for different people of different accessibilities.
Thank you for that. Anyone else like to speak about what the fact is, we're having this conversation about history, we're having this conversation about race in the midst of a pandemic. Are there ways in which the context of the pandemic might relate to any of these kind of conversations we're talking about?
Yeah, I think from a public history perspective, I've heard a couple of really smart scholars refer to this moment as one of dual pandemics, one being, of course, COVID-19, and then one being structural racism and racial inequality. And I think that thinking about how those relate to one another and how they are deeply entwined and that both are a public health issue is really important for all of these conversations, especially in terms of thinking about sort of not just the ramifications of these issues, but sort of the root causes. And it's not just about, what job you currently have and whether or not you're going to have risk, but a lot of the underlying issues come from things like Black communities tend to be much closer to trash processing centers because of decades of real estate redlining and regulations. And so that leads to underlying health issues and asthma and breathing trouble, which we know, of course, is a huge part of your body's response to COVID-19. And so when we think about, I think, public health going forward, and I think it will be much more, I am not a scientist, I am not good at science, but I am much more acutely aware of public health as a daily phenomenon that we cannot ignore. And it will be really important for us to think about those two pandemics and how they relate to one another. And I'm hopeful that this moment, because maybe we're stuck at home and not really able to do a whole lot of other things that we usually can kind of direct our attention away from these issues, I'm hopeful that it will be an opportunity for growth and improvement if we can seize it and continue to push for change.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, it's so fascinating. We're at home, we're watching these events unfold, and a lot of people have said things like, well, we've been able to watch, what happened to George Floyd, and, you can't ignore that happening, and yet we've had these experiences before where there has been, video footage and evidence showing exactly the way that police enact the violence on Black bodies. And yet, I think that because of the pandemic, because we are so at home and because we have, frankly, the time, there's no basketball, well, there is basketball now, but there was no sports, there weren't, other distractions, we weren't going to work, we weren't going out to school, we were able to focus on these issues. I think is just so important. And then I also think it's fascinating that while all of this is happening, we are losing a generation of civil rights activists and are having to kind of grapple with the loss of people like C.T. Vivian and John Lewis and kind of what that means. And I thought that it was so profound that John Lewis wrote an op-ed to be published on the day of his funeral, because it really is a passing of the torch. And I think he understood that. He went out, left, he was quite unwell when he went down to DC to the Black Lives Matter way. And I think he wanted to send that message, just to make these connections. And so, this pandemic is just horrific on so many levels. And yet it really has forced us to distilled these issues that go back generations, and that, we are all part of these conversations and we have a responsibility to act.
I think just also, I think it was worded perfectly that we're in a time right now where we're really facing two pandemics and like this double burden that we're having to realize that so many Black people just have to face on a daily basis. I know for me in particular, it's been extremely enlightening, just in the sense that so much theory and just so much of the, like on the academic side, so much of what I've learned about public health, I'm now fully being able to see it be applied, and if anything, just exacerbated just by the ways in which our government has been responding to this. But I think it also just speaks to how we have to, as we're learning about racism, it's not even just on a structural level, even in the sense of healthcare, right? So we know that African Americans are disproportionately, met with systematic obstacles that keep them from being able to get information about healthcare services, but also just to even have those resources readily available to be able to have for you and your family. But even on an individual level, just being able to openly now talk about eugenics still being a problem within healthcare, and implicit bias, being held by so many physicians, which cause so many different disparities within public health for with Black people and also just people of color right now. So I know during the beginning of the summer, whenever we saw the grassroots uprising of so many Black Lives Matter movements on different local regions, the first thing I thought of was just how much respect and how much I just want to commend protesters and people wanting to physically get involved, because as I said before, I mean, there is a double burden to that. So for all those protesters going out and fighting, against the horrible pandemic of systematic and structural racism, at the end of the day, you're being put at risk, and the extent to which you're being put at risk is, unfortunately, not only do you have a higher likelihood of getting COVID, but even after you get COVID, there is a higher likelihood of fatality, as well as just malpractice and just disproportionate levels of access. So it's a lot to think about, and this is definitely a great time to reflect not just on our healthcare system, but how people of different socioeconomic status are being impacted right now the most.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, we have questions pouring in now, and they're really, really fantastic. I wanna ask one about, I'm gonna try to combine two questions here if I can. We've got two questions about diversity beyond issues of just African Americans. One of them points out how UTD talks about its diversity and is proud of sharing its diversity, yet of course that diversity doesn't really reflect the diversity of the community that we are purported to serve. How African American, Latinx, and Indigenous students are still underrepresented despite the diversity that we have at UTD. But we have another question here asking about how the movement against white supremacy, with its historical grounding in African American history, relates to other minority cultures such as Native Americans, Hispanics, and etc. So we've got two different kind of, I think, invitations for us to reflect on white supremacy more broadly, both beyond and kind of intersecting with issues beyond Black and white.
I'll jump in. Yeah, this is a great question, and this is one that the history field itself is really, I think, coming to a bit of a breaking point, because a lot of historians have made significant strides in thinking about how to incorporate white supremacy and racial relations between Black and white communities in their work and in their thinking about historical figures, and then are trying to share that work with the public, but in doing so are often contributing to the erasure of Native communities or other forms of minorities, as you said. And so, for example, a great example of this would be the Grant documentary, the 3-part miniseries that was on Memorial Day weekend on the History Channel. And for the first time in a Grant documentary, there was a conversation about race and slavery and how Grant had owned an enslaved individual and what that meant, and how his thinking about slavery perhaps evolved over time, and the flaws and the sort of the real failures of he and his wife, especially before the war. But it didn't really tackle his very harmful Native American policies post-war, especially when he was in the presidency. And so that's just one example. I'm not saying that the History Channel gets everything right, because obviously we know that it doesn't, but that's just one example of where a moment of improvement has occurred, and yet there is still much to be done. That's not a very hopeful answer, and it's not necessarily a solution, but I acknowledge, I 100% agree. This is something that I think have to think about. And for another quick example that I want to point out is when we look at the statistics about how certain communities are hit by COVID-19, a lot of the statistics don't even include Native Americans on those graphs. And we know that Native American communities, particularly, I think the Cherokee community, has been horrifically hit by this pandemic and this disease. And so that is something that I think we all need to push for, that just because it is a small percentage of the population does not mean that it doesn't exist, and doesn't mean that those numbers should be included in their own section, not just as other.
Thank you. Okay, I like this question. It slightly, and I mean, I'm going to read it as perhaps slightly challenging for us historians that want to talk about the value of history and commemoration to contemporary issues. So we have a question that asks: Black Lives Matter and Black activism murals and statues have been popping up around the country. So our conversation about monuments has to both acknowledge that those that are going down and those that are going up. And this questioner says that these can bring the community together and highlight Black history, but can we consider these stepping stones to dismantling racism? Or are these murals, these new things, merely performative? How do we know the difference between what's performative and that which actually is a stepping stone to making a difference?
I would just say that I'm okay with the performative aspects of that. You know, let's put those murals up. Let's see this alternate history, these other kinds of heroes, because they have been in the African American community all along. You know, I don't think that we have just because you know, you have people out there saying that, you know, Frederick Douglass, he's getting a lot of attention all of a sudden, you know, oh, he's big right now. That doesn't mean that the African-American community does not recognize its heroes and celebrate its heroes, and hasn't always done so. And so I think that it's a beautiful thing to take a look around us and to see individuals who are serving the community right now, and to celebrate this work, because, you know, I don't think we should wait until someone is passed away, or we need to celebrate people's work right now, because as we were hearing from Tamara and Axum, and, you know, I think all of us, this is exhausting work. And I think that it's important to recognize that work at the time and give people the credit that's due them for taking on these issues, because yeah, it is exhausting. It can be debilitating, as we were saying, that people being out there week after week on the front lines, you know, they're putting their own health at risk to kind of speak truth to power. And I think that it's a beautiful thing that work is being recognized in real time. And so I don't think that it should be the end of the kind of recognition and the kind of conversation, discussion of what kind of recognition is merited, but I do not have a problem with that kind of in the moment work of celebrating people who are just out there putting their, and quite literally in a lot of cases, their lives on the line.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think during this time, at least to me, what I think makes it performative is that I think everything that Black people and, definitely the protesters on the front line are advocating for is for actual justice. And so, while I have no issue at all with, the different monuments that are being up, the beautiful like Black Lives Matter mural that was done in I believe it was either Chicago or New York, I have no problem with it. But I think what makes it labeled as performative is because we're advocating for justice. We're advocating for the murderers of Breonna Taylor to be arrested. And so in response to that, we're getting painting, or we're getting material, we're getting things that aren't actual direct responses to what we've been advocating for. So I think I share the same thoughts as Dr. Conrad in that I'm here for it, but as long as this activism is going to be genuine in getting to the source of the problem, then I think that this will only aid in getting adequate representation, and more than anything, just making sure that the monuments that we do have are accurately reflecting the values of our nation. Because if we were sitting here saying that we have a nation that is freedom for all, and we're supposed to have a governing body that's representative of its people, we need to make sure that the things that we are giving representation to do in the most holistic way possible reflect that as well.
Thank
I would
you.
like to comment also along with the same words that you all are expressing, is that just as those monuments in the past, the visual artwork and things affected me as a child, I think that the monuments and the murals and things that we are seeing, even though no matter how temporary, I think they are making an impact on young people who see that, because some of us are visual learners, such as myself, and I think it's saying something. I've run into my white counterparts, my white relatives. They say, "Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that." And I always believe, I had a supervisor said, once you know better, you do better. So I see it a very positive thing. And even if it's just chalk art on the street, it has made an impact. It has educated a person. And to that, that's a valuable thing that goes with a person for life.
Thank you. Okay, we have just a few minutes left, but I do want to at least begin a conversation about turning towards constructive actions and solutions. And I want to combine a couple of questions and conversations that we've had in the chat about actions that these folks would like to be seen. So first, we have a question about let's start with this one. In response to the UTD's administration's oppression, the students have outlined, how would the panel, especially those with power and privilege, suggest that people navigate the white fragility that is ever present in these conversations with administration? I've got something I could say about that one, but let's combine that with a couple of other ones. We have a faculty member who joined us who was really saddened to hear Tamara's comment that she feels like there's not faculty that she can go to. What can faculty do to support the concerns of students in this regard? And then finally, I'll say that we have a comment here about what about actions from the administration to deal with the fallout from the president's town hall. Apparently, the person who, I'm not interested in naming names, made the comparison between Juneteenth and Confederate Heroes Day, has issued an apology, but perhaps that apology hasn't reached students. What would you like to see these people do in response to this? Okay, so that's a lot. I guess this is also just a general prompt that in our remaining minutes, if you want to call for kind of some specific action to move to constructive solutions to these issues we talked about, please.
So since some of the stuff was regarding directly what I would talk to, I guess I'll go first. As far as UTD's oppression and how to manage that and the best ways to get that deconstructed is start reporting the things that you see. Me personally, I didn't even know I could report professors for some of the things I've done. I've done a lot of growing this past 3 months, and I realized some of the things that my professors have said to me in office hours are completely out of line. And if I were to go back freshman, sophomore, and junior year, some of those professors would not be here had I reported some of that information. So one thing I can say is if you are a faculty member, student, alumni, whatever, if you see something, say something to somebody and get it reported to the right person. Because one of the biggest things we've had in the Living Our Values Task Force is, well, no one's told me. And so it doesn't exist. And that's one of the biggest things we've had to fight for the past 3 months. And I've contributed to that, and I know other students have. So we just need to really get those resources out there on who to report inappropriate behavior to on and off campus and get that information reported. I know it's hard sometimes, but saying something now could make something easier for somebody later on in the future, and that's really important. The second thing is, what can admin do, both with dealing with the fallout and just in general, is we have our task force meetings every Wednesday. Reach out to Rafael Martin, the vice president, and reach out to Dean Dr. George Baer, who is the Dean of Interdisciplinary Studies. They have their emails out there. If you want to be a part of the conversation, Ben Wright has graciously dropped our petition of action in the chat multiple times. Reach out to the heads of that committee so you can get your voice heard, because there are people on there who are exhausted with the work that we're doing. We can use all the help that we can get. And as far as the fallout between the president's town hall is, first and foremost, email the students as well an apology, because we never received one, I guarantee you that. And then just make sure that on one of our points is making sure faculty and staff has more diversity equity training. I feel like that didn't happen as an accident, and I feel like if they had more training on ways to be more responsive and be more culturally sensitive, then things like this would have never had to happen, and we wouldn't be sitting here right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add, just to really emphasize how much we need, more expertise on our side. So if you're reading through the list of demands and there's anything that you feel as though you can contribute to in any way possible, please, even if that's just sending an email or sitting in on a meeting or drafting anything, that expertise that faculty and staff have is going to be incredibly invaluable right now. Because unfortunately, a lot of the burden as far as the mapping out and drafting the logistics of how these demands are going to be met is unfortunately falling on students. And our expertise can only go just as far as our own experiences. So if there's anything that anyone can contribute, it would be extremely meaningful for you to reach out now. And I also just wanted to say too that some of the response that we've seen, at least in some dialogue, some of the microaggressions in the sense of pushback has been that non-Black or non-people of color can't fully be able to contribute to these conversations. They're not fully able to empathize, or I guess do some of the work that's involved in these demands being met, or even just allyship in general. But part of allyship is being able to it is being able to do some of the work and personally hold yourself accountable. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that they are misstepping because they're not a person of color, just because they're not fully contributing, or they're not fully able to see what, like for example, a multicultural orientation looks like. If your expertise is in orientations at all, or community engagement, or just student services in any realm, that is something that's something that's worth contributing in any way, because we're Black students advocating for all of these things, but at the same time, we need the people that are in these professions to be able to help guide us in the right way.
Thank you for that. Okay, we really are out of time, but I want to just acknowledge a few other comments that came through in the chat. First of all, what Tamara was describing is, were violations of UTD's non-discrimination policy. And as she noted that when folks report these things, it does create a paper trail that enables positive change. So when violations like this do occur, please do report them. I also want to maybe go back. I want to quickly say that I want to remind folks that we're going to have action items coming out of this conversation that will go out on our email list. If you're still not on the email list, make sure you sign up, and you can walk away with some very specific things that you can do from here. In one last final note, I want to take my chair's prerogative and address the question about what a few things that faculty can do. And I'll say that one, I do my best to be an ally, but I also have to recognize that there are limitations to what I can do as a white faculty member. And in fact, maybe the most important thing that I can do is to use all of my leverage that I can to ensure that we stop making sure that our faculty has Black scholars so wildly underrepresented in the faculty ranks. I can do everything I can to try to be open and try to be supportive, but there are limitations to what I can do, and I hope that faculty will make this a higher priority, not only in our existing hiring practices, but also in targeted searches that can meet the needs for our students. All right, with that, we are over time, and I want to thank the students for all of their work here. Also thank the planning folks, that so many people's work went into this. Please sign up for the email list. Stay tuned for more steps that you can take, and join us for our future teach-ins as we work to make UTD a better place. Thank you all.